Welcome to our deep dive into Luke 1:26 to 38.
Yeah, the Christmas story, we all do. But today, we're really going to kind of go behind the scenes with this passage and explore how pastors are breathing fresh life into it for their
That
congregations.
sounds great. I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. One of the things that I found so fascinating is that we often get so fixated on Mary being, highly favored.
Right.
But, that word in the Greek is really tied to grace.
Mhm.
So it's less about, Mary's inherent worthiness and more about God's anticipatory grace. Like he was already moving towards her.
That's a subtle but really powerful shift, isn't it?
It is. And it kind of changes how we might present Mary's yes,
Like a response.
Yeah, exactly. And one pastor likened it to a film director casting a role.
Okay.
So Mary isn't at an audition desperately trying to impress,
Yeah.
God has already chosen her, and her acceptance is a response to that preemptive grace.
That's a fantastic illustration.
I thought so too.
Yeah, it really gets rid of that Mary was just a special vibe
Right.
and puts the focus back on God's initiative.
Absolutely.
What other kind of interesting approaches did you find?
Well, several pastors kind of delved into the emotional complexity of Mary's situation.
Interesting.
Sure, we see her acceptance, but was she really okay with all of this? You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a good point. We kind of tend to gloss over that whole internal struggle.
Exactly right. Imagine being a young, unmarried woman in that culture, told you'd conceive a child divinely.
Yeah.
That's a lot to process.
It is a lot to process, yeah.
And one pastor pointed out that, while other biblical figures often react with fear when they encounter the divine,
Right.
Mary is contemplative. She asks questions.
Hmm.
This isn't blind obedience. This is a deep, thoughtful faith.
That's a really interesting distinction.
Yeah.
So how can we as preachers kind of use that insight to connect with our congregations today?
Well, I think it really humanizes Mary. It makes her relatable. You can ask your listeners, have you ever felt God asking something that seemed crazy? What was your internal reaction?
Yeah.
It kind of invites them to engage with the text honestly, not just accept this sanitized version.
I like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it can lead to some really powerful conversations.
Okay, now for the Greek word genomai, I know a lot of the sermons highlighted that. So how did they go beyond the typical let it be interpretation?
Yeah, that's a good one. Think of it less like accepting passively and more like a ship turning its sails to catch the wind.
Okay.
So genomai implies this deliberate yielding to God's direction.
Oh, interesting.
And one pastor even challenged his congregation to use genomai as a prayer,
Yeah.
to actively align themselves with God's will even when it's disruptive, even when it doesn't make sense.
That's a pretty powerful call to action.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah, taking it from intellectual understanding to practical application.
Exactly.
Now, I was also struck by how many sermons connected Mary's story to broader themes of justice and inclusion.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Mary, a young woman from a marginalized background, chosen to be the mother of God, that's a powerful image. And several pastors use this to really challenge their congregations.
Absolutely.
They asked, who are the Marys in our community? Are we offering them grace and opportunity, recognizing their potential, or are we overlooking them?
Right. Are we kind of falling into those same traps that people fell into back then?
Exactly. And it's a question that I think we all need to ask ourselves regularly.
It's such a relevant and timely message.
Yeah,
It brings the ancient world right into our present-day context.
it does. It does.
And it also kind of reframes what divine favor means.
Right.
It's not about privilege or ease. It's about being chosen for a purpose,
Right.
often one that involves, difficulty and challenge.
That's a great point. So many people assume that being blessed by God means a life free from hardship.
Right.
But, Mary's story and the stories of so many others in Scripture show us that's not the case.
Absolutely not.
Being chosen by God often means walking a difficult path, but walking it with His grace and strength.
Yeah, and sometimes that can be more of a challenge
It absolutely can.
than we anticipate.
And, speaking of challenge, one pastor used the analogy of whitewater rafting to illustrate this.
I do love a good analogy, so tell me more about that.
So he described being thrown into the rapids, feeling completely out of control.
Okay.
But instead of fighting the current, you learn to swim with it, to trust the guide, to navigate the challenges.
Oh, I like that.
It's a visceral way to illustrate surrendering to God's plan, even when it feels scary and unknown.
That's brilliant and so relatable. I mean, who hasn't felt like they're being tossed around by life's rapids at some point?
Right.
It's a universal experience.
Yeah.
And it takes this abstract theological concept
Yeah.
and makes it tangible, even exciting. you know.
Exactly, and that sense of adventure of embracing the unknown is really at the heart of faith.
Yeah.
It's not about playing it safe, but about saying, Genomai, turning our sails towards God's wind and seeing where it takes us.
Now, this whole discussion, kind of makes me think about that intriguing concept of the middle voice of faith that popped up in a few of the sermons.
Yeah.
And it's something that I think as preachers, we need to understand if we're going to explain it effectively to our congregations.
You're right. It can be a tricky one to explain.
It can.
Instead of getting bogged down in the Greek grammar, one pastor explained it beautifully. He said, imagine Mary is dancing with God.
Okay.
So she follows his lead, but she's also an active participant in the dance.
I love that image.
Yeah, it's really lovely.
It really captures that dynamic interplay between divine will and human agency.
Yes, it's not about passively waiting for God to do everything or stubbornly trying to force our own will on the situation.
Right.
It's about this beautiful partnership, this back and forth, where we respond to God's leading, but we also bring our own unique gifts and abilities to the table.
So in Mary's case, she said yes to God's call, but she also actively pondered it, asked questions, and ultimately chose to participate in his plan.
Exactly, and that middle voice is something we can all tap into.
It's very empowering.
It is. It's a way of living and moving in the world where we're both receptive to God's guidance and actively engaged in his work.
This has been incredibly insightful. I'm already starting to think about how I can incorporate some of these ideas into my next sermon.
That's great. I'm glad to hear it.
But hold on, we've got a lot more ground to cover with this passage.
We do.
So we'll be right back after a quick break to delve in some fascinating cross-references and sermon illustrations that really bring this passage to life.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to it. One thing that really struck me as I was looking at these sermons was how many pastors used cross-references to add depth and nuance to their sermons on Luke 1:26-38. It's like they were weaving this tapestry, connecting this passage to other parts of Scripture to reveal this richer, more complete picture.
That's a great way to put it. It's not just about isolating this one story, but about seeing how it fits into the grand narrative of God's work in the world. What were some of the cross-references that really stood out to you?
Well, one that came up repeatedly was the connection to the stories of Simeon and Anna.
Oh, yeah.
Those two faithful individuals
Right.
who spent their lives waiting for the Messiah.
Yes.
Oh.
The ones who recognized Jesus as a baby in the temple.
Exactly.
I can see how that ties in beautifully with the theme of anticipation we were discussing earlier.
Absolutely. Simeon and Anna weren't living these glamorous lives,
Right.
They weren't out there seeking fame and fortune,
No.
but they were chosen by God for a specific purpose.
Right.
Their stories, like Mary's, demonstrate that divine favor isn't about worldly success, but about being prepared and available for God to work through you.
And that waiting, that preparation requires a deep trust in God's timing, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Kind of like what Mary was called to do.
Yeah. And speaking of trust,
Okay.
another powerful cross-reference that came up was Gideon's call to lead.
Oh, yeah. I remember that one.
Remember how God told him to reduce his army, making him the ultimate underdog?
Yeah. Right? It seemed completely illogical from a human perspective.
It did. And yet Gideon trusted God's seemingly crazy plan and achieved victory.
That's right.
And this connection to Mary's story, I think, highlights the importance of surrendering to God's will, even when it doesn't make sense to us.
Yeah. It's a reminder that God often works in ways that defy our expectations and calls us to step out in faith, even when we feel inadequate or unprepared.
Right. And that leads us to another cross-reference that I thought was really interesting.
Okay.
Several pastors connected Mary's story to the Sermon on the Mount, specifically the part where Jesus blesses the poor and hungry.
Now, that's an interesting connection. I wouldn't have thought of that immediately.
It's subtle, but it's really profound, I think.
Yeah. How so?
Well, Mary, a young woman from a marginalized background, chosen to be the mother of God, echoes Jesus' message of uplifting the lowly and empowering the vulnerable. It challenges us to ask, who are the poor in spirit in our communities, and how are we extending God's grace to them?
It's a powerful reminder that God often chooses the unexpected, the overlooked, the seemingly insignificant to accomplish his greatest purposes.
Exactly.
And it's a call for us to kind of look beyond our preconceived notions and recognize the potential for greatness in everyone.
Yeah, and it ties back to that point we made earlier about divine favor not being about privilege or comfort.
Right.
It's about being chosen for a purpose, and that purpose often involves walking a path of humility and service.
These cross-references really add a whole new dimension to our understanding of Luke 1:26-38.
They do.
They invite us to see this passage not as an isolated event, but as part of a larger story,
Absolutely.
a story that's still unfolding in our lives today.
And that's what makes preaching and teaching on this passage so exciting. There are so many layers to uncover, so many connections to explore.
Yeah, it's not just a nice Christmas story. It's a story that speaks to the very heart of our faith.
It really does.
And speaking of bringing this story to life, we were talking earlier about those creative sermon illustrations that some pastors use.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear more about those.
Well, one that really stuck with me was the VHS tape analogy.
Oh, yeah, that was a good one.
You know, the pastor was talking about how we tend to put the Christmas story on repeat, watching the same version year after year.
You're getting comfortable with it.
Yeah, exactly. But just like dusting off an old VHS tape, we need to revisit the story with fresh eyes, willing to see it from new angles.
I love that. It's so relatable, especially for those of us who grew up in the VHS era.
Right.
But even for younger generations, it gets at that idea of familiarity breeding complacency.
Absolutely.
We think we know the story, so we stop paying attention.
Right. And this pastor was challenging his congregation to dig deeper,
Okay.
to look for those hidden gems, those nuances that we might have missed before.
Yeah.
And he wasn't just talking about the Christmas story, he was talking about our entire faith journey.
It's so easy to fall into routines and rituals,
Yes.
to go through the motions without really engaging our hearts and minds.
Yeah.
But true faith requires that we're constantly seeking fresh perspectives,
That's-
that we're willing to be surprised and challenged by God's word.
That's where the real growth happens.
Exactly.
And another pastor used a whitewater rafting analogy to illustrate surrender.
Oh, yeah, we talked about that earlier.
He described being thrown into the rapids, feeling completely out of control. But instead of fighting the current, you learn to swim with it, to trust the guide, to navigate the challenges.
Okay, I'm getting the sense that this whitewater rafting analogy was a real crowd pleaser.
It was. It's such a visceral way to describe surrendering to God's will, even when it feels scary and unknown. It's about letting go of our need to control everything and trusting that God is leading us even through the rough waters.
And I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with,
Yeah, letting go of that control.
especially today where we're so used to having control over our lives.
Exactly. And this analogy really gets at that in a powerful way.
Yeah, I love that. It's so much more engaging than just saying surrender to God's will.
Yeah.
It paints a picture. It creates an experience in the listener's mind.
And that's what great preaching does, isn't it? It takes these abstract concepts and makes them tangible, relatable, and even exciting. It helps people connect with the truth of the gospel in a way that resonates with their own lives.
So we've talked about cross-references and illustrations, but I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier, the idea of making this story relevant for today's audience.
Yeah.
Because, let's be honest, sometimes the Christmas story can feel a little, well, dusty.
Right, it can. And that's where these creative approaches come in, you know? It's not about changing the story,
Right.
but about finding new ways to connect it to the lived experiences of people today.
For example.
Well, one pastor talked about how Mary's story is a powerful reminder that God often chooses the unexpected. He pointed out that in our culture, we tend to celebrate those who are loud, outgoing, and in charge. But Mary was a quiet, humble young woman. She wasn't seeking attention or power.
And yet God chose her for this incredible world-changing role.
Exactly. And that challenges our preconceived notions of what it means to be successful or important. It reminds us that God often works through those who are humble and willing to serve rather than those who are seeking their own glory.
It's a great reminder that God sees potential where we often don't.
Yeah.
He's not impressed by our outward accomplishments or social status. He's looking for hearts that are open to his will, hearts that are willing to say, Genomai, and follow his lead no matter where it takes them.
And that's a message that resonates with people from all walks of life. It's a message of hope, of empowerment, of the incredible potential that lies within each of us when we surrender to God's purpose for our lives.
Yeah, as we're talking about this, I'm struck by how many layers there are to this seemingly simple story. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion. There's always more to discover.
That's what makes it such a rich and rewarding passage to study and preach on. And that's what makes these deep dives so valuable. They give us the opportunity to go beyond the surface level and to really wrestle with the text, to explore different perspectives, and to find new meaning and relevance for our lives.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. But before we wrap up this deep dive into Luke 1:26 to 38, I want to touch on one more point that came up in several of the sermons.
Yeah.
The concept of the middle voice of faith.
Yes. The middle voice. This is a fascinating theological concept that can really deepen our understanding of Mary's response to God's call.
Okay, so for those of us who aren't Greek scholars, what exactly is the middle voice?
Well, in simple terms, it's a grammatical term that indicates an action where the subject is both acting and being acted upon. It's this beautiful interplay between human agency and divine will.
So it's not just about passively waiting for God to do something or trying to force our own will on the situation.
Right.
It's about this dynamic partnership, this dance between our efforts and God's guidance.
Exactly. And Mary's story perfectly illustrates this. She actively participated in God's plan, but she didn't initiate it. She surrendered to God's will, but she also made a conscious choice to say yes.
I love how one pastor used a whitewater rafting analogy to explain this. He talked about the experience of being thrown into a raging river and having to learn to swim with the current instead of against it.
That's such a powerful image. It captures that sense of both surrendering to something bigger than ourselves and actively engaging with the forces at play. And it's a great way to help people understand how the middle voice works in their own lives.
Yeah, it's like saying, okay, God, I trust you. I'm going to follow your lead, but I'm also going to use my own strength and abilities to navigate the challenges ahead.
And that's a message that I think we all need to hear sometimes, because it's easy to fall into the trap of either passively waiting for God to do everything or trying to force our own will on the situation. But the middle voice invites us to find that balance, that sweet spot where our efforts and God's guidance work together in harmony.
Okay, before we head into the final part of our deep dive, I want to throw this out to you. What stands out to you about this concept of the middle voice?
Yeah.
How do you see it playing out in your own life, your own ministry, or your own walk with God? Take a moment to reflect on that, and we'll be back in a flash to explore a few more fascinating insights from these sermons on Luke 1:26 to 38.
Yeah, that middle voice idea, actively participating in God's plan while we're surrendering to it.
Right.
It's powerful stuff. And I think something we all need to unpack for ourselves and for our congregations. But, before we get too far ahead, let's circle back to some of those sermon takeaways
Sure.
we were discussing. And one recurring theme that I noticed was how these pastors really challenged the idea of, what divine favor looks like.
Yeah.
Because it's so easy to slip into that prosperity gospel mindset.
Oh, absolutely.
Like if God really favors you, then your life should be easy.
Right, the health and wealth theology.
Yeah, exactly. But that's not what we see with Mary's story
Oh,
or with so many of the narratives in the Bible. It's not about comfort and ease. It's about purpose.
exactly. One pastor pointed out, being chosen by God, it doesn't mean you're immune from hardship.
Right.
In fact, it can often mean deeper purpose, a more significant role in God's story,
Right.
which may include facing challenges and trials.
Absolutely.
So how do you help a congregation sort of grapple with that?
Yeah.
Because let's be real, it's kind of a tough sell when people are in the middle of their own struggles.
It is. It is. And I think the key is really reframing suffering. It's not a punishment.
Right.
It's potentially a part of a larger plan.
Okay.
And another pastor used the analogy of an athlete training for a competition.
Okay.
The grueling workouts, the injuries, they're not signs of failure. They're preparation for something greater.
That's a really helpful image. It takes the focus off the immediate pain and points towards the ultimate goal.
Right. And this is where Mary's story, I think, becomes so powerful.
Yeah.
She said yes to this path that would lead to immense joy, but also unimaginable sorrow. This wasn't naive acceptance. It was deep trust that God was with her even in the midst of future pain.
Yeah, that's a message that resonates so deeply. Even for people who aren't necessarily, Christian or people of faith.
Absolutely.
Because who hasn't gone through some kind of hardship in their life and questioned why it's happening?
That's right.
Mary's story reminds us that even when things are tough, we're not alone in it.
Absolutely. And I think for preachers, her story offers a way to speak honestly about suffering. One pastor even suggested encouraging the congregation to name their own fears and anxieties surrounding God's call on their lives.
Wow, that's pretty bold.
It is. It is. But it also creates space for authenticity.
Yeah.
It acknowledges that faith isn't about pretending that everything's okay.
Right. It's about acknowledging the struggle.
Exactly. And it opens the door for people to connect with Mary on a deeper level, to see her not as this distant, perfect figure,
Right.
but as someone who wrestled with doubt, fear, and uncertainty just like us.
As we're talking about this, I'm reminded of something you mentioned earlier, the emphasis on Mary's marginality.
Yeah.
And it struck me how many pastors use that as a springboard for discussing, social justice and inclusion.
It's such a crucial point. Mary, a young, unmarried woman from a small town, was hardly someone with social standing.
Right.
And yet she was chosen by God for this extraordinary role.
She was.
And several pastors use this to really challenge their congregations.
Hmm.
Are we like God, recognizing the potential in those who are marginalized, or are we overlooking them based on, societal norms?
It's a powerful question that takes the story from the ancient world and plants it firmly in our present-day context.
It does, and it highlights something we often miss. Divine favor isn't about fitting into the world's definition of success.
No, it's not.
It's about aligning ourselves with God's values, values that often marginalize the outcast, the overlooked.
It's a great reminder that God sees things differently than we do.
He does.
And for preachers, it's an opportunity to invite their congregations to expand their own vision, to see the Marys in their own communities, and to extend grace and opportunity to them.
And that brings us back to that idea of Genoito.
Our circle.
It's not just about saying yes to God's plan. It's about actively aligning our hearts and actions with His will.
Yeah.
Even when it means challenging social norms or embracing those the world might reject.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what final thought would you leave with our listeners, the pastors, the Bible study leaders who are prepping to teach on Luke 1:26-38?
I would encourage them to approach this familiar passage with fresh eyes.
Okay.
Don't be afraid to challenge the typical interpretations, to dig into the nuances of the Greek, to explore the emotional complexities of Mary's experience.
And to remember that the power of this story lies not just in what happened 2,000 years ago, but in how it speaks to our lives today.
Yeah. Exactly. So let's not just retell the Christmas story. Let's allow it to challenge our assumptions, to expand our vision, and to inspire us to live out the radical call of Genomai in our own lives and communities.
Well said. I think we've covered a lot of ground here, and I hope our listeners are walking away with a renewed sense of excitement and inspiration for teaching on this incredible passage. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. And remember, even in the most familiar stories, there's always more to discover.